which is like you dose one day and then you take 2 days off. So,
hello.
Hi.
hello.
Nice to see all your friendly faces here. We're going to talk about a mean subject tonight, and we're going to do some work around it. So we're going to talk about the inner critic and its role and why we have to deal with it and all that kind of stuff. So I recognize some of you, so I know some of you have been to my talks before. How many people have not? Okay, so I'm going to do a very quick overview because it's really important to understand the system I'm working with. So we're dealing with developmental trauma, which is bad stuff happens to us when we're kids, essentially, and we grow up dealing with it. Was anybody at the movie this afternoon, the Oregon Psilocybin Society? Mm-hmm. All right, it was great. It was wonderful. It was called Magic Medicine, and it was based on the work that they're doing at the Imperial College around the research around psilocybin and depression. So it was a very, if you ever get a chance to see it, it's a very, I highly recommend it. It's a very realistic assessment of how the psychedelics can help with some of these developmental trauma issues that show up as anxiety and depression and PTSD and relationship issues and money issues and everything else. So what I really liked about the movie is they actually presented about 3 cases, and it was a very realistic representation of how psilocybin can actually help with depression, but it was done in a way where they really made it clear how important it is to do the follow-up work, the integrative work, and that it's not a quick fix. And so basically I'm here to take a stand for the ongoing integration work that we need to do when we're in this growth process, healing process, spiritual process. It's not just that there's something wrong with us, although that's what the inner critic wants to tell us, as we'll soon find out. But it is more about, it's our evolutionary path to grow ourselves into our highest capacities, basically, and that's why I do this work. But the work really stands for the role of psychedelics in the whole process of what we call recovery, and then we get to a stage where it's not recovery anymore, it's just really growing and integration of all of these greater ways that we can know ourselves, not just as a small traumatized individual. So that's what I stand for, and I'm going to put this map to give you a quick overview of the whole structure, and I'm going to go very quickly because I've talked about it. I talk about this every time. But if we look at this dot over here, and this dot's the true self. The true self, what we discover, especially if we're lucky enough to either have a transformative or transcendental experience, either on our own or with the help of a psychedelic, moments of grace come into our lives, and we're able to see that we're connected with a cosmic consciousness that is an aspect of who we are, but we're also embodied in physical form, and so we cannot live in cosmic consciousness. We have to bring it down into the earth, and we have to adapt it to the way that we express ourselves in the world. Okay, so for those of us on this planet, I would say probably 99.9% of us have some sort of trauma. And so we don't get to just come in here and live from this place. So what happens, 2 forms of trauma, abandonment and invasion. So this is where we're being left alone to fend for ourselves as a young person, either emotionally, physically, sexually, mentally. We have an abandonment. That's when a parent actually leaves or cannot be present with us. And then we have invasion. So invasion is when we're actually hit or abused or hurt in some way, or our boundaries are not respected. And we are going to go through developmental stages. So at every stage of the way of our development, we have a different role, a different developmental task that we need to master. And when these issues come up, depending on where the developmental stages that happens, it's going to impact us in whatever way it does at that particular stage. And we're not going to go in. I am going to do a specific workshop on the developmental stages at maybe not the next time, but the time after that. In the next few months, I'm going to do a specific topic on developmental stages and what we have to look at each of those stages and how we can use psychedelics to address what we don't get when we're younger. We can actually use psychedelics. It's really exciting to actually go back into a younger stage and actually heal and address some of those issues that didn't get addressed at the time. Okay, but what happens when this happens? We are experiencing pain. And we're too little to know how to deal with that. Our brain is only formed to a certain degree. And so we cannot handle it. And so what we do is we create a structure, a defensive structure that we are, that is our adaptive persona. Okay, and it's this persona, these are the defense patterns, the addictions, the ways of being in the world that we use to avoid feeling this. And the reason why we avoid feeling this is we don't know that we now have the skills. We didn't have the skills back then, and we had to depend on our parents. So this is an incredibly important piece of where the inner critic comes in. So when we're back there and we've been hurt and we develop a whole system that's in place to defend against that pain, what happens is as we get older, our system is constructed. So we've constructed a psychological system that keeps those defenses in place so that we don't feel that pain. And they stay in place even if we're perfectly capable now as an adult to find a different way of dealing with the pain. But the defense structures don't know that we're out of that situation. They've been built as reaction to that time in history. And how many of you are familiar with IFS or parts work? Okay, so just a couple of you. So IFS, or internal family systems, is built on the same idea that we have a true self, and this true self would have been the self that knows, that's attuned and knows how to operate in the world. Maybe not our society as well, but ideally, we would know how to operate in the world in a way that makes sense and works in a way that's harmonious and is attuned and has the capacity to be in the heart and to allow ourselves to unfold in a way that is in harmony with our environment and with the different aspects and needs of the self. But because this gets ruptured, these defense structures then separate us from that capacity. And so if you go onto my website, you'll see that all of my previous talks, we've identified what the true self capacities are: wisdom, compassion, ability to flow, joy. So we've done some of that work before, and we'll keep revisiting that. But that's where we lose, we separate from that capacity. And in that separation from that capacity, we feel lost and we feel separated because we don't have access to the wisdom and the intuitive knowing and the inner knowledge that is actually within us at all times to access, but we separate ourselves from that. So how do we separate ourselves? We separate ourselves by these personas or these protective devices, which we're not going to go into detail here, but we essentially, the idea in internal family systems is that there is a true self. What stands between the true self and these coping mechanisms is our wounded parts, or what they call exiles. Just call them the wounded little parts of ourself. And this is important when we're going to talk about the critic. And on the exterior is where we have what is called the protectors. So these protectors, how many of you binge on Netflix sometimes? Come on, fess up. All right. What about alcohol? Okay. Buying sprees, sugar. All right. So these protectors are the ways that we try to dissociate from this pain that we're feeling. because this little one inside didn't know how to deal with it, and so it's still inside, it still doesn't know how to deal with it. Okay, but we now have the capacities as an adult to learn how to get back in touch with this. All right, so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at one of these protectors, which is the inner critic. And the inner critic is such a huge protector that it's actually one of the veils over the whole system. It's not just one small part. We may hear it as a little voice that sometimes says what?
You're not good enough.
You're not good enough.
You can't do that.
You can't do that.
Unsustainable.
Unsustainable. Unsustainable?
Yeah.
Okay.
Your inner
do
critic
that.
is very.
Oh, you can't do that.
You can't do
Okay.
Unattractive.
Yes, unattractive. What else do people's inner voice tell them?
What's wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
It's all your fault.
It's all your fault.
Not deserving.
Okay, not deserving.
Lazy, dumb.
What?
Lazy, dumb.
Oh yeah, lazy, dumb. See, if this is good, because if we talk about it, then the inner critic likes to go into hiding. So by actually talking it out, we get to okay, come on out. Let's come out. Let's not hide anymore, and let's actually come out so I can see you. Because if I can see you, then I can work with you. If I can't see you, you're going to get me. Okay. So I had a very interesting revelation recently, and that was that the inner critic controlled most of my life. All of my life. All of the time. Unless I'm absolutely operating from here. There's no only sometime. It's like all the time. So let's look at the ways that the inner critic actually does that. Because I bet you some of you, we can hear that voice, right? We can feel guilty. Okay, so when we feel guilty, that's an inner critic voice. When we feel shame, that's an inner critic voice. However, some of us may not be aware that there are other ways that the inner critic operates. And that's what I want us to spell out so we really get this. How many of you are familiar with the perfectionist? Okay, so what happens when you're in your mode of how does the inner critic work through the perfectionist?
Not good enough.
Nothing's good enough.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how good we do, it's not good enough. And so here's another little piece. So there's a developmental stage where we learn that we can be an agent of our life, where we learn that we have the capacity to act and get something we want. So imagine the little kid who sees the cookie in the cookie jar, right? And so that little kid, if he's raised well, he will decide he wants the cookie. He'll initiate the action of getting the cookie. He'll follow through to get the cookie. And then he'll get the cookie. He'll complete the action. So we have initiation, follow through, completion. But what does he do when he gets the cookie?
Cookie's not good enough?
No, because we're talking about the healthy kid.
Or
Not the traumatized kid.
He eats it and then he goes back out and plays.
He eats it. He celebrates. He celebrates what he got. But what do? That cookie's not good enough.
right.
You know, that wasn't the right cookie.
Don't even try.
Okay, so that's where the perfectionism stops us, even at the initiation phase. This is the inner critic operating. Because what is the voice underneath the perfection? Is that don't even bother.
I'm not good enough to get the cookie.
I'm not good enough to get the cookie, so I'm not going to even bother. So everywhere you have an aspect of that initiate, follow through, complete, and you fail at one of those stages, there's an inner critic in operation. Okay, so this is another way. But remember we talked about it hiding. So we didn't, how many of you knew that there was an inner critic behind the perfectionist that you were? So sometimes we think, well, we're just making ourselves better. What's the difference between being ruled by the inner critic and being ruled by a true self that really does want to expand and become better and truly better at everything that I could be? What is the difference between those two places, and how do you know?
I think that one's coming from a place of like self-love and self-compassion, and that one's coming from like self-deprecation.
Yeah. So the feeling of the true self is joy. Celebrating the cookie I got. That feels really good. Taking some time off to play, having a good time, and then just, mulling about, hey, what's next? What would feel really good right now to do next, to expand myself? But the critic doesn't let us rest, or doesn't let us complete, doesn't let us celebrate. And we're on to the next thing because we have to keep proving ourselves. So that's the perfectionist. Let's look at another one. Well, we kind of talked about the next one. How many people have the taskmaster, which doesn't let you stop and breathe and celebrate, right? Just makes you keep going. Okay, this is a good one too. Okay, when we're stuck in some of our addiction habits, so we're feeling out of control, God, I watched that. I spent 3 hours in front of Netflix last night, or I ate too much sugar. So there's the abusive voice, but then what does the abusive voice comes in and it tries to control me so that next time I won't do that. So that's another way that the inner critic operates, is by trying to control the behavior that it thinks is not okay. So it's kind of like an edge, isn't it? Because we have an addiction behavior that's actually covering up a wounded child. But we have a controller that's trying to beat us up for having that addictive behavior. So what might be a better way to deal with that? So let's say we go into an addictive behavior that we realize wasn't serving us very well. If we weren't going to go into this aspect of the inner critic, then what would we do instead? And it's actually the way that I recovered from my eating disorder. For those of you who've seen me talk before, I had a 20-year eating disorder that I worked really hard on, and nothing worked until I did this next thing we're going to talk about.
Allowance.
So it has to come from true self. And how would true self relate to this? So all the healing has to come from true self. It cannot come from another device on the external circle. So it cannot come from a controller. That will not heal, that just makes it worse. It has to come from in here. And so if you're functioning out here, what from here would actually enable this to heal?
Self-compassion.
Yes, so self-compassion. So that was my last binge episode, was, laying on the bed, having, eaten a hole through boxes of cookies and stuffing myself, and I just laid there and loved myself through it, and that was the last one. Basically, I cut off the cord that the inner critic could come in and get me on that one. Okay. We already talked a little bit about this one, but I wanted to just list these so you have them, that you can recognize them in yourself. So the underminer, everything that you do is not good enough. Everything, you're worthless. We've talked about that. You shouldn't exist. Oh no, that's the next one. Underminer, inadequate. You'll never amount to anything. How many people have heard that voice? Okay. That's a really subtle one, because what does it tell you?
Is that where self sabotage comes
Yeah.
in? You achieve something, you're doing really well, and then you screw it up.
Well, that would definitely be.
Yeah.
So so that would be like, it's not safe to feel this good,
Yeah.
or it's not safe to be this successful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the self-sabotage, so the saboteur would come in and then take that down. This is all about protecting the system. So let me show you what that means. When we're in the true self, we have, here's 0, which is sort of like despair and depression. And where, let's say the 10 would be what we're going to call just the most alive and joyous we can feel. According to the system that we grew up in, our psyche rests at the place that it has learned is the most comfortable. It doesn't care if it's down here, here, or here. So if you dare, if you dare to do something that takes you, if your family of origin lived at around a 3 or a 2, my handwriting's great. Okay, if your family of origin puts you at an aliveness level of about 2, which is pretty much what my family did, then anytime I would try to do something that brought me up a little higher, the saboteur, something would have to come in to bring me back down to a 2. And why are we doing this?
Safe.
Safe. So that brings us back to safety. Safe. And why is it safe?
It's all we know.
It's all we know. And it's familiar. And we don't know what's outside in that scary unknown.
Does the imposter syndrome pull into that?
Okay.
Sorry to get apart with you.
So give me an example. I'm sure it does. Of course it does. But give me an example.
So say you achieve something and you think, I'm not really this good, I don't deserve this, and so, looking back, that's where the self-sabotage probably came out of maybe the imposter syndrome.
So the imposter syndrome is an inner critic telling you that what you're doing is way beyond comfort zone. So of course it's going to give you the messages is that that's not okay. And why is it not okay? Because you can't be that good. You can't feel that good. Right? So of course the imposter syndrome would be all of that. Pretty much everything that, all the devices that we use to keep us down, to bring in negativity around who we are and what we're doing, to make it not okay, to be our joyous, spontaneous, fun, alive self, all of that, whatever it is, that voice is a dampener and is the inner critic voice. Okay. I think this is a very interesting one, and I'm going to put it here. So here we have the destroyer. So the destroyer, that just wants to kill you. The destroyer, I think, comes from something that's very young. It says it's not safe to exist, it's not okay to be in the world. And it's out to get you. It's very negative. It's what drives people to suicide, obviously. It's what was underlying my whole life, was the destroyer. I mean, having an eating disorder is a destroyer energy. So just be aware of that. Notice it's very nihilistic. There's nothing okay. There's no reason, there's no good reason to be here.
And Jane, what do you think, what would cause that?
Lack of nurture, for one. I'm sure there are many reasons, but if you're born into a world and mother wasn't warm and nurturing and you never got held, so we know that we need to be held. Babies will die if they're not loved.
Yeah, I could say, like, I would say that my son, I have a teenage son, definitely has struggled with that. And that's not true. Right?
That's a good point.
I don't know. And I've talked to so many young people
Yes.
who are in that place of, you know, suicidal ideation and, you know, just, I don't deserve to exist.
So think about it. You're forming as a young adult, and you're lost and you don't know where you belong. And you look out into the culture and like, what do you see?
Sure.
So we're not raised in a culture that supports our being. And we're not raised in a culture that supports us learning how to become who we are meant to be on our soul path.
But then that's more of a pubescent ideation and not a very young.
Right. So that's a different birth, right? When we're birthing into adulthood from pubescence, right? Yes, we're birthing again. So there's stages of birthing, and what's out there to mirror to us who we are and who we can become. I know that on my first MDMA journey, which is where I saw where my destroyer came from, and what I saw, it had nothing to do with what I thought it was, which was a narcissistic mother. My pattern of destroying myself was just simply that as soon as I stepped into the MDMA, I knew what my work as a medicine woman was. I never had known that or seen that, so I was shown myself. And that the fact was that the tools of who I was meant to be in the world were illegal in our culture. So if I had been born in another culture, that would not have been a question. But there was nothing in my culture to mirror back to me what my soul calling was.
So our responsibility for that collective inner critic, I don't know, it's hard for me to really love your question, but I feel that, anyway, but I feel the cosmic conscious because you see that she finds that in her son and in friends of her son, and I see like what is out there to mirror too. So it's like where that lead us, you know, to embrace this inner critic and find like I want to be that self-true, you know, with the self-compassion for myself or for the cosmic collective conscious, you know, or because healing myself, I will be healing the others.
Absolutely. So that's all of our destiny is to bring healing. And to bring healing to ourselves, and in bring healing to ourselves, we bring healing to others. However, in my particular case, it wasn't enough to have compassion. Because I could have compassion. I had done so much work on getting here. And this is where the psychedelic piece is so important. Because it wasn't until I had access to medicine in a conscious way that I was shown something that I would never could ever have seen, even with all the compassion in the world. I don't know how I ever would have found like that calling or that sense of self that I saw. And that's not true for everybody, but I think that that we do have the capacity that we're given these medicines to help us reach into areas of our soul and our connection to who our greater self is as a being on this planet. And that it's a tragedy that this is something that we have to do in secret. Because our culture does not mirror. Some of us, yes, I mean, if we're born to be attorneys, which is something that some of us are born to do. You know, if we're born to be, I don't know, whatever we are in this culture that's given, or researchers, for example. That's wonderful. We get accolades for that. We see ourselves in that. But if we're born to be something that's hidden, that nothing around us is showing us what it is, I don't know how we have access to that. And I don't think that any amount of certain areas of true self can give that to us until we're able to have it. In tribal cultures, that's what the vision quests and the rites of passages were about. Where the whole community came around to support a young person through that stage of life to find out their calling in life. And we're missing that, and it's a tragedy.
It's a true vulnerable communication.
Hmm?
It's a true vulnerable communication.
Yes.
On this process that we're hitting, if you find in the movie that we saw today,
Yeah.
They go through the realization and the extremely joy through the experience, you know. But then they go back to mirroring with their own reality, and then go back to that destroying behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So that I saw the lack of true, vulnerable, real communication between the patient
Oh, that's
that took the
interesting.
medicine and his parents and the family, and he said like, it's hard to just share what you saw in that experience.
Yes. Yes.
To heal and go through.
Yes. So that's true. So it's important. I think the point you're making, and I think it's very true too, is that we need to have empathy. We need to have reflection. Reflection is crucial. We don't know ourselves without reflection. And we know when we're with somebody who sees us, right? We know that. It's an inner sense of this person gets me. So that's why we want to have more and more of that in our lives and give ourselves permission to have that true reflection. Okay, only two other ones I'll run by really quickly, but we have the guilt tripper, so everything we do we feel guilty about. That's pretty obvious. And this is probably something maybe some of you didn't think about. It's called the molder, but it's the part of us that keeps us in the social norm. So it keeps that whatever we do is going to be and is going to have a place in the social norm. So an example would be, well, somebody give me an example. So when you do something out of your social system, the system, remember, this is the system. And what does the system support? The system supports what?
Conformity.
Conformity. But conformity to who?
Authority.
And who's the authority in the system? That each one of us is created. There's an authority in the system.
The inner critic is.
No, the inner critic is in service to
Right.
the authority, but who's the authority?
Ego?
Hmm?
The ego, the mind?
Your persona.
No, that might be somebody. That might be somebody's system.
Parents?
The parents. So it's the parental and the conditioning that we've been given in the environment that we've been raised. Essentially, that's the system. So the system has nothing to do with who we truly are. So until we're willing to step out, remember, of like, I had to step out of my two, one step at a time, you know, like maybe I'm about here now, lucky me, but like it took many decades of hard work to create a new system. And a major piece of that work is the inner critic. Okay, so we can do some work with the inner critic today, if you want to. Unless you have any other things that you would prefer to do.
Any ideas?
Oh, okay, so another important part of the system is who is the inner critic protecting? Hmm?
Well, the child damaged.
Okay, so specifically, we can call the child that the inner critic is protecting is your criticized child. It's not protecting the true self, because the true self doesn't need protection. So let's say let's say you're in a sort of so-so relationship, and you know that this relationship isn't serving you, and you want to get out of this relationship, but every time you try to take a step out, you hear the voice. And what would the voice be saying?
Can't do any better. It's as good
You
as
better
it
not.
gets.
You better not, because you don't know that you may be alone for the rest of your life.
Something's better than nothing.
And then suppose you go and you have this amazing journey, and you've discovered and you have this vision for this whole new world that you want to step into, and you go home and you start, guess what happened and what I saw, and guess what? It's not received well. What's the inner critic going to do? Because right then, on that journey, you're up here somewhere, right? This is a big piece of why I feel it's so important that we do the integrative work beforehand and afterwards, because we're preparing the psyche for being able to function at this higher level of itself. So if we don't do that work, and we have this amazing experience, and we go home and tell our partner, and we say, this is this amazing experience, and they sort of look blankly like, what? Yikes, and that's like that threatens that partner's whole world. Then we're left with feeling helpless, hopeless. You had this vision, we had this vision, I can't, now what do I do? Do I leave this relationship? Do I stay in this relationship? And so we need to begin to have a system of working with ourselves to prepare ourselves for these kinds of changes that the psychedelic stuff can bring on. So underneath the critic is the criticized child. So we can identify, once we identify this, so we need the situation, we need the critic, we need to know what the critic's telling us, and then we need to begin looking for the criticized child, because if there's a critic, the critic's protecting something. And this criticized child is in the shadows somewhere, and she or he are not going to let us go forward until it is seen, heard from, and acknowledged, valued, and respected. So it will do whatever it needs to do to pull the system down. The system will come down. I don't care how many psychedelic journeys you've done to get up to 10, if you have not dealt with your inner critic and your criticized child, you won't stay there. Does that make sense? So today, we get to work with that. And I have two ways I like to work with it. And there are two ways of working with it that you can choose. We'll do both. We'll do both. But how many of you are familiar with Byron Katie's work? Okay, so she's self-enlightened, realized woman that was like a depressed, crazy mess that was in a home for crazy, depressed people. And she had pretty much everything at that time, and she just couldn't, she was so depressed that nobody knew what to do with her, so they put her in this place. So she went to sleep one night, she woke up the next morning, and she had this massive realization, and she saw that everything that she felt was a thought in her mind. And so she wrote a book called The Work, and now she's written many books, and she's out there a lot. She does a lot of work with people. She has a whole school. Just Google her, you'll find her, and you'll find her 4 questions. She's got 4 questions.
I'm sorry, can you say her name again?
Byron Katie, so B-Y-R-O-N.
Male name first.
Yep. Byron Katie. She's an amazing woman. She's done a great deal to bring awareness to the power of our thoughts and what we can do to free ourselves from the power of those massive destructive thinking patterns that we have. So we're gonna do a little piece with her work on our own little inner critic. And the other little piece of work we're gonna do is from IFS, where we're gonna work with identifying our inner critic, having that part, acknowledging that the inner critic is a part, it's not the self. It's only a part. Because the self is grounded, aware, wise, intuitive, creative, flowing. That's who we're meant to be. That's ourself. So when the inner critic comes in, it's a part, and it's a part that is on the outside. It's a defensive part. It's a protective part. And what's it protecting? The criticized child. So in order to start being aware of working with this critic so it sort of backs off a little bit, we have to also work with the criticized child. So that's what we're going to do. Okay. So what I would like for you each to do is think of 2 areas in your life or 2 incidences specifically where you can identify that one of these voices of your critic. Okay, and then we're gonna work with it. So before we just think about that for a moment, actually, since that's what, I have no idea what time it is. Quarter to 6. Quarter to 6. So we've been here since 5. Okay, so we've been 45 minutes. Good. So we have about another 45 minutes. I think as you're thinking about that, I'm going to pass. We're going to ask for donations to pay for the space and to support PPS for all the good work it's doing. And if you haven't already and you want to give me your name, email, and phone number, I will include you on my personal, this is my personal email list. If you've already signed it, you don't need to do it again. Because we do workshops and events, and we will send out information about that. Okay, we're going to take a couple of minute break here. So while we're breaking just for a minute and while we're passing things, does anybody have any ahas or comments or anything that they'd like to share with the group? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, regarding inner critic, right? What if inner critic is right sometimes? What if something that inner critic criticizes?
Wait, say this again?
What if the inner critic is right sometimes? What if, you screw up and then you beat yourself up, but it sort of serves you well in terms of you not repeating that mistake?
This is an interesting question. So let me ask somebody else out here to answer it. Anybody else have an answer to that question?
I feel like sometimes the inner critic, I don't know if it's the inner critic identifying it, but for instance, struggling with addiction, I've been really hard on myself when I'm in an addictive place, really hard on myself, but that oftentimes that being really hard on myself doesn't make it better, and yeah, being compassionate does, so I don't know, I feel like the inner critic is more of just kind of just being an asshole, and you're the one who's the true self maybe is being really compassionate and nice, and so they can both be looking at the same thing maybe, I don't know.
I think it depends on the nature of the criticism, whether it is constructive or whether it's something that's intended to break somebody down.
Oh, so it's the difference between constructive, quote, constructive criticism versus, is that what you're saying?
Versus something that's intended to break you down.
Right. So, yeah, so its intention is to destroy you on some level or make you feel really bad.
Which means that perhaps it's not based in reality as much as, for example, if something is telling you that you're a failure, for example, that's so general, you know, and it doesn't have any, it doesn't mean anything, it's so vague, and yet it does mean a tremendous amount to the person that's hearing that voice repeatedly, you know. So there's no real substance to it.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. So yeah, so some part of the self that would be give us constructive quote criticism. I wouldn't use that word, but constructive criticism would be something that would support us to grow. And then the voice of it, just you're just a failure. There's no support in that. But yeah, oh, then you.
Okay. Yeah, just.
I'm sorry to point.
It's fine. Yeah, just building on that. Yeah, distinguishing between the constructive self-criticism and the inner critic. The inner critic is, if it's a quote-unquote good or effective inner critic, is going to adopt the language of the constructive self-criticism. Sneaky. And the smarter you are, the smarter your inner critic will be at using the language of, you know, constructive self-criticism to undercut everything you attempt to do.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example?
Oh, just, you know, just being hypercritical. Let's say you're trying to write a paper, you know, and it's like, you know, gee, you know, I've read better than this, and you're comparing yourself to, like, you know, amazing writers, and so that, you know, putting that bar that high, you're guaranteed not to get there.
Yes.
So stop where you are, because, and you know, if your inner critic is smart enough, it can, you know, talk about, you know, examples that you're not measuring up to.
Okay, so that was an example of perfectionist.
Yeah.
And then there's definitely underminer, operating, too. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
I think maybe it's sometimes when we take the mistake that we make too personal, a lot of the mistake we make actually is not because of us, it's because of a lot of other factors that's not under our control, and we just take things too personal.
Yeah, it makes it all about us instead of it just being something that happened.
Yeah.
So something happened. And I think the big problem is that we think we're in control of it anyway.
It's tricky.
It's tricky, like how much charge do we actually have? Yes, did you want to say?
Well,
okay.
The thing that comes to mind for me, and I really appreciate that he brought that question, you know, what if he's right? You know? And in listening and where I resist is when you go into the inner self and it's always just something really wonderful. You know, do you have the courage to go to the inner self if you find out that it's all not something wonderful? You know, is it necessary? And I think it's the battle in my anthroposophical speak of it. It's the Luciferic is the leading you off to the light. Everything's going to be okay. And there's kind of a lot of that speak in this. And the Ahrimanic, the demon of our time, the demon of materialism is saying if you can't cut it, if you can't measure it, then it's not real, sort of a thing. And those put together are very constructive forces to help you find balance on your way. So you don't know if you're listening to the wisdom that you hope that you're getting awarded with for asking for it, you know, or if you're being criticizing, you know, but neither should you just float off. So that I struggle with that piece of that. That's why I'm being cautious.
Yeah. So sure, you know, I had an eating disorder. Every day I was criticizing myself for the eating disorder. And like I said, I didn't really end the eating disorder until I held it into compassion. But was that my criticism of the eating disorder bad or wrong, or I shouldn't have had that? No, it was like some aspect of me knew that it was creating more pain. So in some ways it was actually giving me some wisdom in the only way it knew how. But I think the key is the voice trying to shut you down. Does the voice shut you down, or does it aid your growth and move you forward? So I think that's the key piece. That's what we're looking for.
So for word to word, like I have a big question that I always do myself is about the common good. sorry for if I interrupt. But it's the common good, you know, of us looking ourselves, discussing about this topic, trying to find what is the truth about this. I think like about the opportunity of the system, if we deserve or not, or we appreciate this experience of existence. So my opinion is to trust in the here and now, with where we are, you know. So if that inner critics lead us forward to trust that we are where we need to be,
Exactly.
then it's good, you know, and
Right.
and you can measure it with the palpitation
Yes.
of your heart as a
Okay, and I agree totally 100% with what you're saying, and talking about developmental stages, okay? So there is a point in time where the need for the harshness of the critic to pull us down becomes less, it's less needed, and where we can listen to a kind of more compassionate voice that's pushing us forward. So we may, at earlier stages of development, and I don't mean, it's just that we don't have the resources yet in place to be able to work from here. Because we can work from here and grow and hear the compassionate voice of, you know what you did wasn't exactly the best way to handle it. Why don't we try it this way and move you forward without the berating voice of, you jerk, that was really stupid. So it's like that distinction, but until we get here and we're able to do that for ourselves, then we function, then that critic could come in that harsher manner and cut us down. But I think I think that we'll get a sense of the difference when we do these next two exercises. And you can kind of assess, well, what works best for you in this particular situation? I had to ask myself, did that voice ever really, did that voice ever really, truly get me to where I wanted to go? No. And it still doesn't. But what it does do is it alerts me, if I'm willing to listen to its underlying purpose and the criticized child underneath, if I'm using that voice and I'm now listening to what are the needs in my system that are not being met that can take me up a notch, then it has a really good purpose. But then if I'm using it to beat myself up and to drop down a notch, I'm not using it well. So maybe that's the difference, how we want to use that voice for ourselves in that moment.
I think that's very well said.
Oh, good. Sometimes I just have to I don't know.
Just keep talking until the good stuff comes out.
Yeah, exactly. And try not to beat myself up in the process when it doesn't. Okay, so let's work with the first one. So everybody has one particular voice that they're going to work with, right? Okay, so kind of do this in Heart's Work style, or IFS style. So we're going to start by, I think what I want us to do first is start by, let's close our eyes and just bring our awareness into our heart or our breath. And begin to intentionally connect with what we do associate as our true self or our higher self. So it's like forming some kind of anchor to the place of presence that's here right now. And the way that I like to do it is I like to just become aware of my breath, become aware of my feet on the ground. If I have a spot in my body that feels more open and light, then I'll focus there. Like right now, my head feels pretty expanded in my forehead, third eye chakra area, so I'll go there. That's not always the case. And if we need more help on that, we can think of a time when we felt good about ourselves, or we were in a situation that we felt like we were operating from our highest, most true self. And just bring that memory in and start to let that experience wash over us again. So using our power of imaging, of visualization, to actually allow ourselves to feel what it feels like to feel good about me, feel grounded in my body, and to bring in qualities as much as we're able to in this moment of compassion and witness, pure, objective capacity to witness or observe. And the key piece here in connecting with this true self aspect is to be without judgment. So if you start to hear a judging voice, you're not in the true self, you're in another aspect of critic. So if that happens, it's not an issue that happens a lot for people. The only thing is to know that that is happening and that there's a critic who's snuck in and pretended to be your true self. And we'll just, you'll ask that part to separate out if that part comes, and come back as much as you can to neutral, compassionate awareness. So once we're in there, once you're enough in that place, you can ask, you can go back and revisit the situation you're working with right now and hear the voice of that critic, or experience how you know it's there. It may not be a voice for you, it may be a feeling sense, or it's a body sense of contraction. The key piece here is to identify it, to notice that this is not the voice of your true self. This is the voice of the critic. And that's really all you need to do right now, is name it. Because that in itself begins the healing process. Once we've named it, we're going to now ask this critic to step out somewhere else in the room. Might be just right in front of you. Take a seat by your side, by your feet. Maybe it's flying up above, but just ask it to step out. So if you have the capacity to visual, you can actually see it may take on a form or a shape. It could be a mean monster, it could be the shape of your mother, your father. It doesn't matter. It'll come to you the way it comes to you. Or you may just sense it as, again, a sense of meanness or attacking. See if you can remove yourself or separate yourself from it so it's now outside and separate from this grounded, aware, neutral place. Okay, and we'll just take a moment and we'll just say hello. And ask it, hello. You might want to ask it if it has a name, it may tell you. But you can ask it, how are you trying to help me? Just allow whatever first thing you notice. What do you receive? And now ask it, who are you protecting? And see if you can just call on a littler self, a wounded part that may be hiding in the shadows. Calling this part the criticized child. See if you have a sense of this child, this younger part. Who feels not good enough or ashamed. Or guilty. See if you can coax this child out of hiding. You might want to do this by telling the child that it's now going to be safe. You're not going to allow the critic to hurt it. We've got a paradox here. We have a child who's feeling already criticized. And we have a critic who's continuing the abuse of the child, but thinks it's protecting it. Really believes that it's doing a good job. To protect this child. And that's what we want to go in and we want to examine. Yourself actually has the capacity to nurture. So the true self has a nurturing part, has a nurturing aspect, and it can turn to the criticized child and begin to give that child what it needs. So it may start by just asking this child, telling this child he or she is safe, that you're going to protect it from further attack and abuse, criticism. And you really want to know what he or she needs. Then here's where you sit back in your compassionate listener. Yourself can also turn to the attacker, the critic. And let the critic know that the way it's trying to protect the child doesn't work anymore. It's in fact causing more harm. And let the critic know that there may be another way that this child can get its needs met. So this is a bit of a dance, and we're doing it in a group. I'll give you a little bit more time as you notice this exchange that's going on. It's going to happen in your own way. There may be a back and forth that needs to happen. The criticized child may not feel safe. So you want to continue to work with it to help it feel safer. The inner critic or inner attacker may not step down. So you may need to work with it to show it. That you're now an adult. And that you now have a self that can support the child. Because that critic won't know that. So because we're in a group situation and it's hard for me to assist, which I would be doing individually, we're just going to leave it at that right now. Although I do want to do one other thing. So you can now ask your connection to source or connection to light and love in whatever way that works for you. You can ask for it to come down, come in, call on it, and surround both parts. And notice what happens as each part is surrounded in source energy or light energy or love energy for the purpose of bringing healing. And for bringing them into alignment with the true self. I'll just sit with that for a moment, see what happens. Okay, so we'll thank both parts. And when we're ready, we'll open our eyes, come back into the room and do a little bit of sharing. I want to give each of you a chance to share, so we could break up into a partner, but I'm also really wanting to hear and work with a few of you who maybe got stuck, or I want to hear what happened so I get a sense of what you were able to do with this and what you found out. I think that's what I want to do first, so you get some group participation that way, and then I can have a sense. Did anybody notice anything, learn anything about the part themselves or their parts?
I dissociated and it was really hard for me to stay with in meditation.
Sorry, say that again?
I dissociated and it was very hard for me to stay with in meditation. Like I had no access to any information.
Okay.
I would trail off and then I'd bring it back and trail off and then here.
Okay, so you've done body-centered work? Okay, so if, next time if that happens and you go in, just focus on your body, just focus on keep bringing yourself back and don't worry about it. So that's fine, that's it's just a skill to keep coming back in. Anyone else want to share?
I think for me what happened when I asked my inner critic what it was trying to protect me from, that like it immediately was very clear to me, which was, I don't want you to have your hopes, get your hopes up and then be disappointed. So like, don't think that anything good's gonna happen, because then what if it doesn't? You're gonna feel really bad, like I wanna protect you from that disappointment. And I was trying to maybe like recall episodes where I felt disappointed, and I was having trouble. I got kind of stuck there.
So then did you talk to, that's a really good awareness, by the way. Our critics do that, for sure. And then were you able to get in touch with the child, the criticized child?
I was trying to see if I could like, because I was picturing myself and I was trying to see like when were these moments that you felt disappointed? Because it came to me so strongly, like I don't want you to be disappointed. Like that's happened to you before and it really hurt you, and like I feel like that's there, but I don't know what it is.
And you couldn't find it, so you haven't ever been disappointed. And love it, right? That's a perfect example of how the critic works for many of us. It just tells us lies. You can't find the evidence, the truth. So the next question would be, then what do you do? It's like if you get your hopes up too high and you're in your mind, let's say you're down here, right? Wherever it is, and I don't know what, maybe like at your job or at school or in a relationship or whatever, and you're scared to, but you have a dream of reaching this up here, but like the next step is here. So we can blow ourselves out by going too far too fast. And the only way up to here is to take this next little step. But the critic is going to say, don't even try, it's hopeless, you've never made it before. That's a big lie. And so then the question is like, once you discover, then it's like, well, what do you need? What is the truth that I need in this next step? Which, I don't know, maybe to lower the expectations a little bit. Maybe to follow the next step. Like, what is the truth for me in this moment? Thank you. Okay, yeah.
Maybe something that I guess would be the child was saying something along the lines of, like, why don't you push me up? Why don't you tell me that I can do things that perhaps I can't do, rather than the other way? And the critic was silent. It wasn't, you know, it's like, I don't know if it was this black and white, but the sense that I got was that the child wanted, you know, maybe to be told, like, go for it, like, do it, you might screw up, but it's okay. It's like,
perfect, beautiful, perfect. That's what it's longing to hear. The child is longing to hear. It's okay, and go for it. It's okay if you don't fail. Just do that next step. I mean, if you do fail, whatever I said, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. So you were able to be in touch with the child's need, to be championed.
just for a second, though.
What?
Just for a second.
For a second. With those seconds are key. And by the way, I'll give you all a journal homework assignment that every night before you go to bed, you write down your successes. And you have to find at least 10.
Each day?
From the day or from life?
Listen to that question. Was that a critic? Perhaps.
I made a really good cup of coffee, that's one.
That question, That question. Can I find 10 successes for today? You're not good enough? You can't find 10 successes? Okay, so that's the voice of the critic. And it's to catch it. That's how subtle it is. But we all giggled, right? Because we all related. And we think that that's normal. We think that's normal. It's not. The true self knows it's successful. There's no such thing as failure. Its very being is full of its success. Success isn't even a word because there's no failure. So that idea that we're not successful and we can't find 10 is a lie. It's a big lie. So go home and you have to find 10.
Can they be really small?
They could be very small. Because we only have small ones. There are no big ones.
It's funny, it kind of relates to the child that I was hearing, which was I was dealing with the perfectionist. And when I asked the child, the critical child, why are you, what are you protecting? What I got was, well, because if you do this thing that you're afraid to do, then you could have success, and you don't need that. You don't need the success, because you're fine.
Wow.
Really? And so I feel like that's, again, that lie, like, oh, really? You don't need to have success? You don't need to accomplish something that your creative spirit is calling?
That's a tricky game.
I was thinking the same thing, you know, like not the fear of failure, but the fear of like, yeah, I'm gonna do this and it's gonna work out, and then what? Now I'm gonna do that, you know? So it's like, but I think that's undermining, right? Just completely, just like you undermine yourself right off the bat.
Yes, because, okay, Jason, when you say that, like think about where are you even? Are you even present? Say that voice again, what that voice critic says to you.
The one that says, if you do this, it will work, you will succeed, and do you even want that?
Where are you, and what are you feeling when you say that?
All kinds of stuff. Am I here in the room? I mean, not with this, yeah, everything I do, I feel like works out, you know, like I am able to look back at my life in a lot of ways and be like, well, that worked out. Wish I was ready for what came next. Oh, that worked out. And then, I don't know, then, you know, I some little self-sabotage sometimes, not all the time. Mountain's still going up for the most part, but yeah, some shots I don't take because I don't want to hit.
Mm-hmm. Some shots you don't take because you don't want to hit. The thing is that all we have is right here now, right? We all know that. So every time we do a projection.
Oh, I see, yeah, okay.
That's what I was getting at. Every time we do a projection,
mm-hmm.
whether it's grandiose
mm-hmm.
or demeaning,
mm-hmm.
it's a projection and not real.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I was kind of trying to figure out the difference with the controller. I've got the perfectionist pretty well established in myself. Like, you know, I've got to be perfect to justify being worthy of love and that kind of thing. But I've found recently the controller has been coming out. I'm trying to control situations that I don't need to control, or people that, like, oh, you've got to do this a certain way so that I'll be okay with the situation. Or it's like, I remember being controlled that way and hating it, like being completely oppressed by it, completely angry. And yet finding that come up in myself, it's like, is that a criticism? Like, I mean, if I'm trying to control another situation, then where am I criticizing myself? I'm just trying to figure out how that critic is working to even deal with it.
Yeah, good. So how does it make you feel?
What's that?
How does it make you feel?
I'm confused, a bit of a real disgust with myself.
Mm-hmm. So it's doing a good job, isn't it?
That way, and so
yeah, it's doing a good job.
Yeah.
It's keeping you feeling disgusted with yourself.
Right. So
right.
It's undermining in a way. It's
Right. So then what do you do with that? What did you ask it why it's doing that? What is it protecting?
I did, and I'm still like, I get the sense, well, you know, obviously it's trying to protect me from immediate, you know, sadness or having to look at things that are hard to look at. But beyond that, it's like, where did you even
Something
come from?
bad might happen if you
Right.
let go.
You're gonna have to deal with too much at once, maybe even.
So that's the exploration. Just keep looking at what it's protecting you from and what would happen if you let it go. So that might be, so we can do the next exercise, which is Byron Katie, and we'll do Byron Katie's exercise because you might be able to work with it that way. Okay, so.
I just want to add one other thing. The kind of the flip side of the fear of failure, the fear of success. I'm hearing a little bit of that, and I think that comes from the same source of the fear of if you're successful, you're really a fraud, because sometimes the fear of failure can actually manifest itself in an overdrive to achieve. You know, like so you're constantly trying to put that voice down, so you're determined to be an overachiever in a way, and yet when you get there, you feel like a fraud. So because the voice has been telling you that you're not worthy. So once you do succeed,
okay, so first of all, let me just say this.
Yeah.
If you hear this whole discourse in your mind that you just did, it's like if I get here, then this, and then when I get there, it's all made up.
Right, I understand that. So what happens is you almost be stuck in a limbo in a way.
Then you be here now. And when you be here now, when you recognize the voice is confusing you, it's abusing you, it's protecting something that it doesn't need to protect anymore.
It's like a no-win situation.
Okay, right, so when I was speaking the truth, when I'm saying it is over the whole system, and the only way out is here, and this is be here now. And be here now, once we let that go, the space opens up and it shows us this, here I am now, this is my next step. And there's no garbage up here about what does it mean to be successful, what am I going to do if I am successful, oh my God, or I am going to fail, or I failed before. This is all the garbage in the mind that keeps going round and round and round. It has no bearing on where I am now. You getting that? Like who I am now in this very next step. I might have the sense of where I'm going. And if I just get here now and I listen in here, it's going to show me the next step. And actually that step might have nothing to do with where I think I'm going in my mind. And as a matter of fact, I can guarantee you that's probably true. So what you were just describing is a perfect example of how the inner critic system fouls up our mind, and we get lost in it, and we get spin out days, weeks, years, decades of that kind of thinking that get us nowhere except misery. Absolutely. And when we just let that go, and we're here, which these medicines can do, but if we don't understand what we're talking about here, we don't know how to work with it in our real life. So we can have that experience of be here now. Has anybody had that experience of be here now on a medicine? And then we kind of wonder what happens when the ego comes back in, and we're back into the thing. How do we get back and live that place in our life? So it's recognizing that mind crazy trick that it's doing to us all the time. So there is no success out there. All that's here is now. And just following that next impulse, that next right impulse is what's here. Okay, what time is it?
It's 6:30.
Okay, so let me just do that. Let me do the next one, because this next exercise will help you to unwind all of that, what you just shared. So, oh, by the way, before I forget, Freedom from the Inner Critic by Jay Earley. B-A-R-L-E-Y. And it's Freedom from the Inner Critic. Really good resource for this work, and a book called Soul Without Shame by Byron Brown. Okay, so now you have 3 resources: Byron Katie, Jay Early, and Byron Brown. Okay, so
Jay Early has a huge amount of material on the web, including lots of things that you can do self-paced.
yeah. Okay, so let's do Byron Katie. So Byron Katie, her whole premise is that everything, all our thoughts, unless they make us feel good, our thoughts aren't real, essentially. I may be paraphrasing her in a way that's doing her a disservice, so forgive me. But basically, the idea is that when she had her awakening out of her depression, and she saw that everything in her life that was miserable was only caused by a thought in her mind, that was it, period. So she came up with a system called 4 questions. So you write the question, so you write the thought down. So now you can do this with your inner critic. So you write your thought down, whatever the thought is. And the first question, I want to hear, let's hear a couple of the thoughts.
I actually, yesterday when I was getting out of bed, just half awake, I had this thought that came across my head, and I've been keeping a journal. I just don't see how you can do anything.
Oh, okay.
I just don't see how you can do anything. I'm like, where is this even coming from? I'm just getting out of bed.
Okay, let's see if we can work with that one. I don't see.
You can do anything.
Yeah, that's too big a thought. So you have to have a thought that is specifically an abusive thought. So turn that around, just make it a clearer critical thought. Like if you were to put it in, like you can't do it. It's basically saying you can't do anything, right? That's better. So a simple thought, like you can't do anything. Or you suck.
You suck.
Okay, it's gonna be, okay, that's almost too simple, but you can do that one. You suck, or you can't do anything. Okay.
If I succeed, I'll be criticized.
Okay, if I succeed, I'll be good. That's a good one. They're all good, but just in terms of working this process, I'm gonna encourage you to go online, find her 4 questions. They're free. You can work with this on your own.
Yeah, and I just want to say that the Byron case suggests that people first work with their thoughts about other people.
I know, but we're gonna not do that.
Just so people know that, because the thoughts with other people are a little less triggering than thoughts we have about ourselves.
Yeah, I know. She says you want to work with an attacker on another person first, a judgment on another person. But we're not going to do that here. We're going to do this, and this is what she would say is not okay. We're going to do it anyway, because my higher self says to do it. So, right. What?
A bunch of delinquents here.
So wait, so what was that one? If I succeed, what?
I'll be criticized.
I'll be criticized. Okay. And yours was you can't do.
You can't do anything.
You can't do anything. Okay, and that's a good one too. Okay, and we're gonna leave out the you suck if you don't mind.
That's not
okay, not because you suck or anything.
It's okay.
This is too easy. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to name the thought, which is like, okay, we'll start with you can't do anything. That's the thought. The 4 questions. The first question is it true? Is it true? Very simple. So ask yourself right now, if you look at your thought, is it true?
Maybe.
Okay, so maybe's okay. You said no. Does anybody have yes, it is true? Okay, what's your thought? Because it's true?
Sorry.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, can you make one up that's not about you that you could share? All right, never mind. Okay, if it isn't, if it's a maybe, then you would say, can I absolutely be sure it's true? So basically the first 2 questions are, is it true? And if you say yes or maybe, are you absolutely sure it's true? Can you absolutely be sure it's true?
In a factual way.
Yeah, because you said if I succeed, I'll be criticized.
Absolutely mean like all the time?
Yeah, no, just, did you absolutely know that absolute fact.
No.
Yeah,
Of
or
course
the
it's
answer
not.
might
You
be,
don't
so
know.
what?
Yeah,
You
because
know.
you don't know, so you have to say no. How do you know that?
Right, how do you know that? You don't know for a fact that you're gonna be criticized if you succeed, right? Okay, so that means that that's a no. Okay, so the fourth, remember my Byron Katie, what? Oh God. Is it true? Is it absolutely true? Okay, if you didn't have that thought, so right now what you have to do is remove that thought from your mind. So it's like you're just putting it away and feel what it feels like to not have that thought. If you didn't have that thought, what would you feel? And you have to give yourself the time to experience that. You're experiencing yourself free from that thought. Take a minute, just feel it. So you may have noticed, did anybody notice if you function with that thought more into 2 or 3, where do you feel when you let go of that thought, when that thought's not there? What do you feel?
Better.
Lighter. Better. So that's the whole point. That's what she wants to show you. Then the fourth question is basically the turnaround, which is how do I... The turnaround is going to be a little bit tricky, and it's not going to necessarily be easy, but the turnarounds might be, for example, you can't do anything might be you can do something. So you just say that to yourself. So you're turning the negative into a positive. So try that. Just turn it around to its positive. If I succeed, I'll be criticized. If I succeed, I'll be rewarded. And sit with that and feel what that feels like. So now basically you've got the premise that the thought, you separated yourself from the thought, you were believing the thought to be true, because that's what happens when the critic comes in and just takes over our mind. You separated yourself from it, you asked yourself, is it true? So you could get some distance, and then you turned it around and you just created another thought, which could be equally true. So now she goes into a whole variety of turnarounds that we don't have time to do here. I'm not about teaching Byron Katie, but I just wanted to give you an example of what that might look like to work with her in that way. And I've done lots of thoughts like this, and I've found immense freedom by being able to be that conscious of my critic, turn those thoughts, question it, turn it around, and there's a huge opening that can happen. Then you can start asking, well, who would I be and how could I be in the world if I didn't carry that critic around with me all the time? And am I willing to step into some of those places? It's very exciting. It's very liberating to start playing with who am I without that critical voice. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Okay, so that's, I think that will be anybody have any further thoughts? Any questions?
This reminds me of the analogy of ants, little ants, like when an infestation of ants happens in the kitchen, they get in everything. A-N-T, automatic negative thoughts. When they happen in the head, it floods everything in here, so that awareness, just being aware of those automatic negative thoughts, those ants. It's beautiful. We can start doing more questions and take the time.
Yeah,
it's a nice analogy.
That's beautiful. Thank you for that reminder. Great, ants. Very good. All over. They're growing all over us all the time. What?
That's sort of a biologically driven thing that's now easy to demonstrate in the cognitive sci lab. They say, you know, our self-preservation instinct, whatever accounts for it, the fact is we definitely have what's called a negativity bias. We are biologically driven with no mindfulness to over-focus on the negative and ignore and discount and just gloss over the positive. So this is clearly that process run off the rails.
Thank you all for coming. We're ending a little bit early so we can put stuff away and I can get out of here for a
What
meeting.
is the next session?
At the end of March, there's one.
Okay.
And I don't know yet what the content's going to be.
Is